I never thought I'd run into him again, especially not here. The cabin had always been my safe spot, a place where I could get away from everything. After the divorce, I found myself coming here more often. It was far out, quiet, surrounded by thick trees, the perfect place to escape. That day, I got there late in the afternoon. The sun was setting behind the trees, and long shadows stretched across the small yard in front of the cabin. I unpacked the car, brought my bags inside, and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth and crackling of the fire helped me relax. It felt good to be away from everything. I made some coffee and settled into the old chair by the window, looking out at the woods as they got darker. But something didn't feel right. The usual peace I felt here was replaced by a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on stress. But then I heard it, a twig snapping outside. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But as the night went on, the sounds kept happening. Footsteps crunching in the leaves, moving around the cabin. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light enough to be just an animal either. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me as I looked around the tree line. Nothing moved. I stood there for a while, listening. The woods were too quiet, unnaturally quiet. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to calm down. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. The uneasy feeling kept growing stronger. Every little noise made my heart race. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally decided to try and sleep, hoping I'd feel better in the morning. I got into bed, keeping the flashlight close. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again, the clear sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart pounded in my chest. Whoever it was, they were right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened, hoping they'd go away. But the footsteps didn't leave. Instead, they moved along the side of the cabin, stopping right outside the bedroom window. I stared at the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But there was nothing. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The footsteps finally moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there in the dark, listening for any sign of movement. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but too scared to leave the cabin. I stayed inside, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. As the day went on, I started to relax a bit. The daylight made everything seem less scary. I even managed to step outside for a moment, just to get some fresh air. I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of who or what had been there the night before. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human footprints, circling the cabin. They were fresh, too fresh. My heart sank. I quickly packed my things, throwing everything into the car as fast as I could. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was about to leave, I noticed something in the dirt near the cabin door. A small, folded piece of paper, weighed down by a rock. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. It was a note written in his handwriting. 3 words, "I'm watching you." I dropped the note and backed away, my heart pounding. I jumped into the car and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I never returned to that cabin. I never told anyone what happened, but the fear never left me. Even when I'm alone in my own home, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there, watching. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I heard those same footsteps outside my window, and I know, no matter how far I run, that he'll always be out there, somewhere, waiting. I came across the cabin while hiking through thick woods. It was an old, run-down building, barely visible through the dense trees. The place looked abandoned, like it had been forgotten for years. The wooden walls were faded and gray, the roof was weighed down with moss, and the windows were covered in dirt. Something about it made me want to check it out, even though a small part of me felt uneasy about it. I decided to go inside, thinking it might be a good place to take a break. As I got closer, the air around the cabin seemed different, heavier. The front door made a loud creaking noise as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled musty, like old wood and rot. There was a wooden table in the middle of the room with a few broken chairs around it. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for who knows how long. I stepped inside, leaving clear footprints in the dust. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I noticed that the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars. They were covered in dust, just like everything else, and it was hard to see what was inside them in the dim light. I wiped the dust off one of the jars and saw that it was filled with something that looked like dried plants. Another jar held what looked like small animal bones, brittle and fragile. Suddenly, I heard a creak from the floorboards. I froze. It didn't come from where I was standing. My heart started to race as I turned around to look behind me, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty, just like when I walked in. I told myself it was probably just the old wood shifting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to ignore the uneasiness crawling up my back, I kept exploring the cabin. There was a narrow staircase leading to an upper floor. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed up, the wood feeling weak and ready to give out. The upper floor was just as dusty and abandoned as the rest of the cabin, with an old bed pushed up against one wall and a large, wooden chest in the corner. The chest caught my attention. It was big, made of dark wood, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the better of me. The lid was heavy, and I had to pull hard to open it. Inside, I found a pile of old, moth-eaten clothes, some yellowed papers, and a small metal box. The box was locked, but the lock was rusty and weak. I managed to break it open with a few tugs. Inside the box were old photos, black and white, the edges worn and curling. The photos showed people, families, couples, children, posing in front of the same cabin I was standing in. The clothes they wore were old-fashioned, from a long time ago. As I flipped through the photos, I noticed something strange. The same man was in almost all of them, standing in the background, his face partly hidden or blurry. He was always there, watching, but never clear. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized that the man wasn't part of the families in the photos. He was just there like a shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at the last photo in the stack. It was a picture of the cabin, taken from the outside. And there, standing at the window, was the man, staring out with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. I slammed the box shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. Something was wrong with this place, something dark. I rushed down the stairs, almost tripping in my hurry. As I reached the bottom, I noticed that the front door, which I had left open, was now closed. The unease in my gut turned into full-blown fear. I yanked the door open and bolted out of the cabin, not looking back. As I ran through the woods, I felt something behind me, something cold and unrelenting. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the cabin, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. When I finally dared to look back, the cabin was hidden by the trees, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about those old photos, about the man who was always there, lurking in the background. I never went back to that part of the woods again, but the memory of that cabin and the man in the photos still haunts me. Even now, every so often, I feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm sure I'm alone. Sometimes, when I'm in the dark, I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, but it's enough to make my heart race. I know it's probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling that the man from the photos is still out there, watching, waiting. And I'm terrified that one day, I'll turn around and see him standing there, in the background, just like in those old photos. And this time, he won't be blurry. He'll be real, and he'll be right there, watching me with those empty, dark eyes. I didn't expect my weekend to turn out like this. My neighbor, Sam, invited me to his cabin for a few days. We weren't close friends, but we got along fine, and I thought it would be a nice break. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main roads. Cell service barely worked, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of animals. The first day was normal. We fished at a nearby lake and chopped wood for the fireplace. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. That night, as we sat around the fire inside, I started to feel uneasy. The darkness outside felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in on us, as if the forest was alive and watching. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me. But as the night went on, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I barely slept, waking up at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, Sam suggested a hike deeper into the woods. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't want to seem scared of a few trees. We set out, following a trail that twisted through the dense forest. The trees were so thick in some places that it felt like twilight, even though it was the middle of the day. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following us, but there was nothing. We reached a small clearing after about 2 hours. Sam wanted to keep going, but I was done. My nerves were shot, and all I wanted was to get back to the cabin. We turned around, retracing our steps. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail looked different. Trees that should have been familiar felt out of place, and some turns seemed sharper than I remembered. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired. Then we reached a fork in the trail that we hadn't passed before. There were no signs, no markers, just two paths going in opposite directions. Sam didn't seem worried. He shrugged and picked one, saying it didn't matter which way we went since both should lead back to the cabin. But deep down, I knew we were lost. The sun was sinking, and the woods were getting darker. The sounds around us changed too. What had been the peaceful hum of nature now felt eerie, like something was moving in the shadows just out of sight. I tried to stay calm, to focus on finding our way back, but with every step, my anxiety grew. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled upon the cabin again. I felt relief as I saw the familiar shape through the trees, but that relief was short-lived. As we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The cabin looked different, older, more worn down. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. We had locked up before leaving. Sam pushed the door open. The inside was cold, much colder than it should have been with the fire we had left burning. Everything was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, and there were deep scratches on the walls, as if something had clawed at them. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by the faint creaking of the floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was in the cabin with us, something that had been waiting. Without saying anything, Sam and I grabbed our things and headed for the door. But as we stepped outside, the reality of our situation hit me. The woods were dark, the trail impossible to see. Even if we could find our way back to the car, we were miles from the nearest town. We were trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere. We spent the rest of the night in silence, too afraid to sleep or move. The minutes dragged on, the air thick with fear. I kept my eyes on the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. Nothing ever happened. When the first light of dawn came through the windows, I made up my mind. We had to leave immediately. We packed up what little we had and left the cabin without looking back. As we reached the car and drove away, the tension started to ease, but it never fully went away. Something had changed in those woods, in that cabin. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back, and I'll never talk to Sam about it. Some things are better left forgotten, but I know I won't forget. I'll always remember that feeling, the certainty that something was out there, watching, waiting, and I'll always wonder if it's still there, in those woods, waiting for the next person to wander too far from the safety of the trail. The worst part? Sometimes, late at night, I can't help but think that whatever was waiting for us didn't just stay in that cabin. It might have followed us back. I drove up to the old cabin, a place full of memories from my childhood. My grandmother had always loved it here, hidden away in the woods, far from the city noise. After she passed away, the cabin was left to me, and I decided to spend a weekend there alone to clear my head and remember her. The cabin looked just as I remembered, with its old wooden walls and the small porch that overlooked a quiet, dark pond. The trees around it seemed to lean in, making long shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I settled in, unpacked, and decided to take a walk around the property to enjoy the fresh air and solitude. As evening came, I headed back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly open. I was certain I had locked it, but I brushed off the thought, figuring I must have missed it. I closed it firmly and went inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing noises outside, rustling leaves, soft thuds, and what sounded like footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but the noises were too clear. I turned on all the lights, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and even moved a heavy chair in front of the back door for extra security. The noises grew louder as the night went on, almost like someone was deliberately trying to scare me. Around midnight, I heard a loud bang coming from the storage shed at the edge of the property. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy flashlight I kept for emergencies. I knew I had to check it out, even though every part of me wanted to stay inside. I approached the shed carefully. The door was slightly open, swinging in the light breeze. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a messy pile of old tools and rusty equipment. I shone the light around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to head back, I noticed something unsettling. A set of fresh, muddy footprints leading from the shed to the back of the cabin. They were large and recent. My heart sank as I followed them back to the cabin. The prints stopped right at the edge of the porch. I ran inside and locked the door, my mind racing. Whoever had been outside was clearly trying to get in. I moved the chair away from the back door and decided to stay up, keeping the lights on and listening for any sounds. The night dragged on, but the noises eventually stopped. As dawn broke, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. I decided to pack up and leave early. When I was finally ready to drive away, I noticed that the muddy footprints had been washed away by the rain that had started in the early morning. It seemed like whoever had been there had left just before the storm began. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sense of unease lingered long after I left the cabin. That night, I found a small note hidden under the seat of my car. It was handwritten and simply said, "You were not alone. Watch your back." I never found out who left it or what they wanted, but the realization that someone had been so close, that they had left a message, left me with a chilling reminder. Even in the places where you feel safest, danger can be closer than you think. I had rented a remote cabin for a week, hoping to get away from city life. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The cabin was old but had a cozy feel with its stone fireplace and wooden floors that creaked under my feet. The first few days were just as I hoped, peaceful and relaxing. But on the fourth night, things changed. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard a noise outside. It was a soft scratching sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. I thought it was probably a small animal or a branch hitting the side of the cabin. The scratching went on and off all night, getting louder and more persistent. By morning, I was uneasy but tried to convince myself it was just the wind or animals. I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. As I walked through the woods, I noticed something odd: big, deep scratches on the trees, all pointing towards the cabin. The scratches were fresh, with dark stains on the bark that looked like dried blood. When I got back to the cabin, I saw that the door was slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it tightly. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, checking the room for any signs of someone breaking in. Everything seemed in place, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. That night, the scratching started again, but this time it was more intense. I decided to check it out, grabbing a flashlight and a heavy wrench I found in the cabin's storage closet. I went outside, shining the flashlight around the cabin. The light revealed something disturbing: footprints leading away from the back of the cabin, where the ground was freshly disturbed. The footprints were large and human-like, but they just stopped, as if the person had disappeared suddenly. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the cabin making me jump. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I packed my things quickly, always looking over my shoulder. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The scratching had stopped, but the unsettling feeling remained. A few weeks later, I found out from a local that there had been reports of someone in the area who stalks cabins, sometimes vandalizing them or worse. It hit me hard. I'd been alone in a place where someone with bad intentions could have easily been hiding. The realization was chilling. It was a stark reminder of how isolated and vulnerable one can be, and how quickly a peaceful getaway can become a terrifying ordeal. As I think back, I wonder if that scratching noise was a warning that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The thought that someone might have been hiding in the woods, just beyond my sight, still sends shivers down my spine. We were sent to a remote area deep in the woods, far away from any town. The old cabin we were assigned to looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The roof was a little crooked, and the wood had turned gray from age. There was something creepy about the place, but it was where we had to stay for the next few weeks. First, everything was normal. The nights were quiet, filled with the usual sounds of the forest. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and an occasional owl hooting. But then things started to feel different. It began with small noises. I thought it was just the old cabin settling at first, but soon I noticed the sounds were too regular for that. It was like someone was moving around outside, walking in circles around the cabin. I would sit up in bed, listening hard to catch every little sound. The whole time, I felt like someone or something was watching us from the darkness just beyond the trees. One night, I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, almost like whoever it was knew we were inside. I held my breath, hoping they'd go away, but they didn't. Instead, the door creaked, like someone was trying to open it. The latch held, but the door kept shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I grabbed my rifle, my hands trembling as I pointed it at the door. But just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I was left alone in the silence, with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They were from a person. Barefoot, deep prints like someone had been walking around all night. The others shrugged it off, saying it was probably one of us fooling around. But I knew better. There was something wrong out here, something that didn't want us here. The last night I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening. And then I heard it again, those footsteps, but this time they were inside. They were slow, careful, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. I stayed still, trying to tell myself it was all in my head. But then I heard breathing, low and rough, coming from the corner of the room. I was frozen with fear. I wanted to jump up, to grab my rifle, but I couldn't move. The breathing got louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to me. I could feel its heat on my face, smell the nasty odor that came with it. And then, just like that, it stopped. The next morning, I packed my stuff and left the cabin. I didn't care about orders. I couldn't stay there another minute. As I walked away, I could feel eyes on me, watching me leave. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew whatever had been there with us was still there, and it wasn't going anywhere. It was just waiting for the next group to come along. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I'll never forget that cabin, the way it felt like it was alive, like it was aware of us the whole time. And I'll never go back. Some places are better left alone, no matter what anyone says. The worst part, every now and then, late at night, I can still hear that breathing. It's like a faint echo, just out of reach, as if the cabin found a way to follow me. Maybe it's all in my head, or maybe once you've been there, a part of you never really leaves. And that thought, more than anything, keeps me up at night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away. My ex-wife and I thought that spending a few days in a cabin far away from everything might help ease some of the tension after the divorce. We didn't have kids, so there was no reason to stay in touch, but there was still a lot that hadn't been talked about. We figured that a quiet weekend in the woods might help us leave things on better terms. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town, and there was no cell service. It was a small, old wooden place with one bedroom, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen. It felt like the kind of place that had been there forever, like it had seen a lot of people come and go. The first night was quiet. We made a simple dinner, talked a little, and went to bed early. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that feels more like an agreement to avoid certain topics than a natural part of being alone in the woods. We both pretended to sleep, but it was clear that neither of us was comfortable. The unease was too strong to ignore. The next day, we decided to go for a walk. The paths around the cabin were narrow and overgrown, but we figured it would be a good way to pass the time. We walked for hours, barely speaking, just listening to the sound of our footsteps and the wind in the trees. It felt like the forest was watching us, the way the trees seemed to close in as the path narrowed. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was almost dark. That night, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like the cabin itself was alive, watching us, listening to us. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that being so far away from everything was making me paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. In the middle of the night, I got up to use the bathroom. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the last bits of wood burning in the fireplace. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a noise behind me, a soft creak like someone was stepping on an old floorboard. I stopped and listened, but the sound didn't come again. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing, just the empty hallway leading back to the bedroom. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, closer this time, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway was still empty. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I got back to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every little sound the cabin made. It felt like the place was shifting, groaning under some invisible weight. My ex-wife was sleeping soundly beside me, unaware of the tension growing inside me. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, but the feeling of being watched only got stronger. The next morning, I woke up to find her gone. Her side of the bed was cold, the blankets pulled back neatly. I called out her name, but there was no answer. I searched the cabin, but she was nowhere to be found. Her things were still there, her bag and clothes untouched. Panic started to set in. I ran outside, shouting for her, but the woods seemed to swallow my voice. The path we had walked the day before looked different, almost like it had never been there. I had no idea what to do, so I went back inside, hoping she had just gone for a walk and would be back soon. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of her. I tried to tell myself she had just left, that she had decided to go without waking me up. But the car keys were still on the counter, and her phone was dead on the nightstand. As night came, the cabin felt colder. The dread I had felt the night before returned, but it was worse this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her, something I couldn't explain. The silence in the cabin was crushing, pressing in on me from every side. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the dying flames, waiting for something to happen, for her to come back. But she never did. When the morning finally came, I grabbed my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the police. They searched the woods for days but found nothing. No sign of her, no clue that she had ever been there at all. I still don't know what happened to her that night. The cabin is still there, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it. Sometimes I wonder if it was the cabin itself that took her, like it needed something from her, something it couldn't get from just anyone. I've never gone back, and I never will. Whatever happened in those woods, it's something that will stay with me forever. The memory of that place haunts me, a dark shadow I can't escape, whispering that some things should never be found. And every now and then, in the dead of night, I wake up with the feeling that I'm still being watched, that whatever was in that cabin followed me home, waiting for the right moment to take something from me too.